The sun was beginning to rise behind the large windows of the Armed Forces headquarters in Ouagadougou. The first rays of light cut through the morning mist with a golden light, illuminating the cool marble of the main hall. Inside, the silence was almost religious. Soldiers walked with controlled steps, without speaking, without laughing. This was no ordinary day. It was the day of an emergency meeting between the country's most influential generals and the man whom until recently few had dared to even look directly at, IBRAHIM TRAORÉ. Traoré entered through the main door without announcing his presence. He wore a simple uniform, without medals, without ostentation. No guard preceded him, no entourage accompanied him, just him, his thoughts, and a leather briefcase under his arm. His face was serene, but his gaze carried the firmness of someone who has weathered storms inside and out. Those around him, even the most rigid, avoided looking him directly. He walked between them as if he were part of the architecture, and at the same time larger than everything around him. At the head of the long, heavy, dark mahogany table sat General Cambo, one of the last remnants of the old Burkinabe military hierarchy. His raised chin, polished decorations, and impatient expression showed that he did not see Traoré as an equal, but rather as an intruder. He barely waited for the president to sit down. He whispered something to another officer and laughed contemptuously, as if he were unafraid of masks or of what was to come. This was the beginning of a meeting that would change more than tactical decisions. A clash of power, dignity, and ego was about to take place, and no one in the room knew that what would unfold next would be etched not in secret documents, but in the soul of the country. General Cambo was not a man of mincing words. Known for his rigidity and authoritarian temperament, he was accustomed to leading with his voice rather than by example. Traoré had barely sat down when he slammed his hand on the table, breaking the brief silence that had formed. "Gentlemen, we are here to discuss military strategy, not to listen to political speeches," he said, his eyes fixed on Traoré as if he were marking his territory. The atmosphere immediately became tense. Some officers glanced at each other, others kept their heads lowered. Traoré, as usual, remained silent for a few seconds. He watched the general with calm but intense eyes, like someone analyzing a chess piece that tries to move too soon. Instead of responding to the provocation, he slowly opened his briefcase, took out a few documents, and placed them in front of him. His calm gesture contrasted with the aggressive tone that echoed across the table. It was as if he were waiting for Cambo to sink into his words alone. "With all due respect, Mr. President," Cambo continued, now standing, "you have ideas, speeches, but we have experience of war. The people need strength, not philosophy." His voice was firm, thick with thinly veiled contempt. He gestured arrogantly, trying to provoke a reaction, any reaction. But Traoré was unfazed. His fingers drummed lightly on the table. The room seemed to hold its breath. The tension was palpable. This was not just a clash of ideas, it was a battle of the ages. Old militarism versus new African leadership, brute force versus strategic intelligence, contempt versus dignity. This room was not just a meeting place. It was the stage for a silent battle, and everyone there knew they were about to witness something historic. The temperature in the room seemed to rise, even with the central air conditioning running. The mood was no longer just discomfort, it was almost military tension, as if something were about to explode. General Cambo began to walk slowly around the table, his boots echoing on the marble floor. "While we were sweating blood in the Sahel, you were writing manifestos and speeches at international conferences," he teased, looking directly at Traoré. The phrase carried venom, and the other officers remained in deathly silence. Traoré did not respond immediately. He simply adjusted a small piece of paper on the table, as if nothing had been said. His posture was one of complete self-control. But his eyes said it all. They did not show anger, they showed calculation. They watched Cambo's every move with surgical precision, as if they already knew the outcome, even though the audience was still trying to understand the play. Cambo moved closer. Now he was right next to Traoré, imposing his physical presence like a bull trying to intimidate a lion. "President or not, remember who still commands the battalions," he whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. It was at that moment that the tension reached its invisible peak. There was something symbolic in that approach. The old power, wanting to dominate through the weight of hierarchy, forgetting that dignity does not need to shout to be respected. The officers present barely blinked. No one dared to intervene. The atmosphere was so charged that a false gesture was enough to break the barrier of silence. The question was no longer about military strategy. It was about who truly represented the spirit of a new Africa. And there, in that room, the question was about to be answered with something stronger than weapons or shouts, with words. Traoré looked up calmly, as if he had finally decided to play the final piece on the chessboard. His voice was steady, slow, as calm as thunder about to fall. "General Cambo," he said, without raising his voice, "for years you have marched with weapons, but you have never learned to march with honor. That is why today I am sitting where I am, and you are standing where you have always been." The sentence cut through the air like a steel blade. There was no need to shout. It was said with surgical precision, and it caused an earthquake. The general froze. For a moment, it seemed as if his uniform weighed more than his body. His expression hardened, but it was impossible to hide the subtle tremor in his jaw. His arrogance began to deflate like a punctured balloon. Some officers looked away, others hid their breaths. They had never seen anyone look at Cambo like that, much less take him down with a single sentence. It was at that moment that the door to the room opened. An intelligence captain entered, carrying a sealed report with the presidential seal. Without looking at the general, he handed it directly into Traoré's hands. The president simply nodded. "Here are the records of overpriced contracts signed by you over the last 2 years, while you claimed to be defending the people," he said, with the same calm coldness. The turnaround was complete. Cambo's public humiliation was no longer just moral. It was now institutional. There were no screams. There was no immediate arrest, only the devastating silence that falls when the truth imposes itself on the mask of arrogance. Cambo slowly returned to his seat, his shoulders slumped and his eyes empty. The table was no longer his, the room either. Everyone there knew the one who had given the most powerful order that day was the one who had remained silent the longest. The room, previously charged with tension and dispute, fell into an even denser silence. But now, it was a different kind of silence. Not the silence of threat or fear, but the silence of respect, of recognition. Some officers, who had previously seemed indecisive or even complicit with Kambo's behavior, now kept their eyes fixed on Traoré with a mixture of surprise and admiration. Power had changed hands without a single drop of blood, without a shouted order, only with truth, courage, and dignity. General Kambo, once proud, could not even keep his gaze raised. Sitting in his chair, he seemed shrunken inside his own uniform, like a crumbling monument. That figure who used fear as a weapon now seemed vulnerable before a leadership that did not need to shout to assert itself. He was the living image of a past in decline, before a present that no longer depended on uniforms to define authority. Traoré, for his part, did not express victory. He simply calmly put the papers in his briefcase and adjusted his chair as if he were in another ordinary meeting. But for everyone else present, there was nothing ordinary about that moment. He did not need to say anything else. His posture had already said it all. He was the president, not only by office, but by conduct, a leader who imposed himself with truth and not with fear. Slowly, the other officers began to stand up, not out of protocol, but out of impulse. It was as if a new atmosphere had invaded that space, an atmosphere of true respect. The old command had been broken there, in front of everyone, without violence, only with words, ethics, and firmness. And everyone knew, at that moment, more than a victory over Kambo, a new form of leadership had been born in the heart of the armed forces of Burkina Faso. That same day, the news spread silently through the corridors of power. Ministers, advisors, members of parliament, and even journalists began to discreetly comment on what had happened in that closed meeting. No one had images, but the details spread like wildfire. General Kambo was disarmed with one sentence, they said. The phrase was already starting to circulate on local radio stations, social networks, and even in street conversations, like a kind of modern legend that seemed impossible, but irresistibly real. Inside the barracks, the impact was even more direct. Young soldiers began to see Traoré not only as a head of state, but as a commander in spirit, someone who led by example. Officers who had previously hesitated to support him now publicly stood by him, as if the meeting had served as the final proof. He was not only the right man for the job, he was the right man for the times they lived in, a time that demanded quiet courage and moral firmness. Outside the military, the population also began to react. Civil groups, social movements, and even religious leaders commented on the president's stance. A man who silences the noise, with dignity, speaks louder than 1,000 shouts, said an influential community leader during a church service in the interior of the country. Traoré's words resonated as a lesson rather than an answer, and that made him even greater. The people did not need to see the meeting. They could feel the change in the air. Even outside the country, the story reached attentive ears. Ambassadors, international analysts, and foreign media outlets began to notice a pattern. In Burkina Faso, something different was happening. A new kind of leadership was being built, one that didn't impose itself through force, but that didn't give into arrogance. An Africa that didn't bow, but didn't need to roar either. An Africa that looked people in the eye. Late in the afternoon of that same day, IBRAHIM Traoré appeared before the national press in a brief but eagerly awaited broadcast. No pomp, no background music, just a simple table, a Burkina Faso flag in the background, and a president with a firm but serene gaze. When he began to speak, there was no doubt this was a leader who didn't need spectacle, only the truth. "Today, I didn't stand up to defeat a man," he began. "I stood up to defend a principle. Our country can no longer accept fear replacing respect, that authority is confused with arrogance, or that the uniform is greater than honor." His voice was calm, but each word carried the weight of one carrying a nation. There was no anger, there was purpose. He continued, "The time for shouting and fists on the table is over. We are building a new era where respect will be our first weapon and dignity our shield. If I, the president of this nation, can be disrespected in silence, what is left for the people who elected me?" The question fell like a bolt of lightning. It was no longer a personal conflict, but a collective cry, channeled into words. At the end, he looked directly into the camera. "We are not fighting just for territory. We are fighting for a new spirit. An African spirit, free, fair and conscious, and this spirit has already begun to awaken. In every barracks, in every village, in every young person who believes that respect is not asked for, it is imposed with posture." He stood up in silence, without applause. But at that moment, millions gave a standing ovation. Inside, that meeting in the barracks was not just a political episode. It was a symbol, an invisible milestone that separated two eras, that of inherited authoritarianism and that of leadership achieved through morality. What IBRAHIM Traoré did that day was not to defeat an adversary. He showed the people that real power does not shout, does not impose by force, and does not need to prove anything to anyone. He showed that the true leader is the one who inspires, even silence to respect him. The story quickly took on the contours of a legend, and like all powerful legends, it is not limited to the moment in which it occurred. It began to be told in schools, cited in community meetings, shared between parents and children, not because of the scandal, but because of the example of a man who knew how to use the right word at the right time, with the strength of 1,000 armies, a president who won without humiliating, who corrected without condemning, who led with the posture of a true African statesman. The popular reaction intensified in the following days. Paintings began to appear on the walls of the city with phrases from the speech. Young people began to repeat in conversation circles. Respect is not asked for, it is imposed with posture. The episode stopped being news and became a seed, and like all well-planted seeds, it began to bear fruit, fruits of awareness, pride, and belonging. Perhaps one day many will not even remember the name of the general who tried to intimidate him. But they will remember the phrase, they will remember the look, they will remember the silence, and most importantly, they will remember that a new chapter in African history began not with a war, but with a word spoken by someone who understood that true power is knowing when to use it, and when to simply stand by in silence while the world understands that everything has already been said.